Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I'm the host of Reformed GGA, and today we're going to be doing a field strip and reassembly of this little beastie right here. This is my Galil Ace Gen 2 in 7.62 by 51 NATO. It's also compatible with 308 Winchester. That's not true of all 7.62 by 51 guns, but in this case it is compatible with 308 Winchester. And I have put that to the test. The reason why we're going to go ahead and disassemble it, like I said, is just a basic field strip, not everything, but a basic field strip, and then we're going to reassemble it. And the reason why is, on the one hand, people who haven't had a chance to handle a gun always kind of want to have a little bit of a heads up on, what's going on inside and that kind of thing. Especially people who are considering buying it and whatnot. They want to know what they're getting themselves into. So part of it is just simply informational. The other part, though, is that there is actually a little bit of controversy surrounding these guns in terms of assembly and disassembly. There's some people who seem to think that it is inordinately tough, especially to get them back together, and other people that don't seem to think that it is a super big deal. And so I just want to show you what the process is, at least for me, and you guys will make your own decision as to whether it's, easy enough or too tough or whatever on your own. As always, whenever you're going to mess with a firearm, it's always a good idea to go ahead and check and see that it is empty. First of all, we have an empty mag well. Go ahead and open up the chamber, visually inspect the chamber, run the action briskly a couple of times just to make sure that there's nothing there, and we are good to go. Now, we'll go ahead and we'll get immediately into one part of the controversy. When I disassemble and reassemble this thing, I find it is very useful to have a tool on hand, and the tool that I would recommend is basically just a cartridge to help you take it apart and put it back together. A lot of people would argue that gun assembly and disassembly should be completely toolless, and I definitely agree that that is ideal, but at the same time with certain guns, if having a tool on hand is what you need to get it done and you really like the gun, well, then that's the way you go. And for me, this little takedown tab here at the end of the Galil causes some problems for me, both on disassembly and reassembly, and I find that I'm greatly aided by using a cartridge. Now, what I'm going to do is just take the cartridge and I'm going to push it in this little takedown tab inside the receiver and push it down just a little bit so that it catches on the rear trunnion instead of coming back out. I've tried to take this down by hand, pushing my thumb in there and trying to keep the thing pressed inside the receiver while I disassemble it, and I usually can't just get it quite far enough in to make the disassembly process easier, so using something to push it further in works for me. So go ahead and we'll do that. Now, it should be noted that anytime you use a tool like this, there is always a chance that you could risk marring something, and so be aware of that. I find it's fairly minimal, but it's going to depend. So once you've got the takedown tab pushed into the receiver and pushed it down just a little bit so that it's resting on the rear trunnion instead of coming back out, then you can go ahead and take the dust cover off. And the dust cover is held in basically by tension at this point, and that tension is going to be such that it's the way that you would fight against it, we'll say, is by pushing forward on it relative to the natural orientation of the gun, and then slightly up, and I'm just going to go ahead and wiggle it a little bit. There we go. I have tried to take this off, we'll say, a little bit more aggressively in the past and managed to conk myself in the face with it, and that does not feel very good. But there is the dust cover, and you can see that I, of course, fixed my optic to the dust cover, because with Galils, that's basically what the dust cover is designed to do. It is designed to be what holds the optic in. So set that to the side for now. And then we have the guts of the gun, and they're very, very, very AK-like. Not quite the same as a standard AK, but very similar. And one of those similarities is, of course, that you have the recoil spring that feeds into the back of the bolt carrier. But unlike normal AKs, this recoil spring is a tubular design. In a normal AK, it's basically just a couple of metal rings that slide into each other, kind of metal loops that slide into each other. But in this case, it's actually tubes that slide into each other. And that actually makes this less flexible. With a normal AK, you can just push forward and rip it out, and it's not a big deal. This one, because it has a tube design instead of those metal loops, you need to be careful about the angle that it goes through. You don't want to push it through too much of an angle, because then you'll bend the tubes. So I'm going to push in, going to turn it basically 90 degrees. This is its normal normal orientation is like so. And I'm just going to turn it 90 degrees and gently pull it out without bending up too much, because then you risk bending the tubes that are inside of this recoil spring. So we'll take a little bit closer look at this, and on the back you'll see this little rubber gasket that's at the end of it. Now on some of the Galils, in addition to the rubber gasket, there'll also be a little rubber buffer, and the reason for both of these actually is basically to stop or slow down internal wear and tear on the gun. It's not, neither of them are really necessary for the gun functioning, but what they do is they help prevent wear and tear, and especially this one on the back. A lot of people think that it is there to seal up the gun and prevent dust and grime from getting inside of it, and that's not really true. The rear tab of an AK, and that's basically what the Galil is. It's just a more modernized version of an AK. On AK type designs, the rear tab point that comes through the dust cover, that's never been a major ingress point. It's never been a major concern, never been a major point of failure. But when it comes to retaining zero, which is important for the Galil because its dust cover is what usually holds the optic in this, at least in this iteration, the Ace Gen 2 is designed to hold the optic. And if this this takedown tab didn't have this little rubber gasket around it, that takedown tab would be metal on metal with that rear opening in the dust cover. It would shake around in there and actually widen out that little hole and make the dust cover less stable. So what this little gasket is doing is that it's preventing wear and tear, and therefore helping you maintain zero. And I have taken this out and shot it a little bit. Not a ton, we're only looking at around 200 rounds through it so far. So there's not a whole lot of wear and tear on any of the parts because I haven't shot it a ton. But it does seem to retain zero just fine. Now granted, I'm shooting usually at like a 12-inch target at 200 yards, so that's not an overly hard standard, but it's enough that, you know, if I put everything back together, even after cycling the action a few times, it doesn't really mess with anything, and that's what I would want. They never guarantee that this is going to retain zero, you know, down to like, you know, quarter MOA or anything like that. And it's an AK type battle rifle. It's not really designed to be ultra precise in the first place, and if you're using generic ammo, don't expect it to be ultra precise. I was using some steel case, just some Wolf Military Classic 308 Winchester stuff, and I was getting groups that were about 3 to 3.5 MOA. At 200 yards, I was getting roughly 6 to 7 inch groups, so 3.5 MOA roughly. And so yeah, it's not really designed to be a tack driver, especially if you're not firing match ammunition through it. Not to say that they can't be accurate. There are people out there who use actual precision loads and whatnot and get much better results, usually under 2 MOA if you find the right ammo that it likes. But me, I shoot cheap, and so yeah, I'm not getting that kind of accuracy out of it, and therefore my standard of accuracy just isn't going to be super high. Like I said, making sure that I'm still on kind of a medium-sized plate at 200 yards is perfectly fine for me, and it retains zero that well. And basically just doing the disassembly and reassembly process that I'm showing you guys. So that is the recoil spring. And then after you've got the recoil spring out, you can go ahead and take out the bolts and bolt carrier. There's of course the charging handle on the opposite side that you will pull back. And as you go over the bolt, the hammer, you will encounter just a little bit of resistance. Then I'm going to take it up, and again I'm going to be careful about yanking it up too much, just because of how tight the Galil's tolerances are compared to other AKs. So keeping it fairly horizontal. With other AKs, you can usually pull it up higher, but this is not quite a standard AK. It's close, but it's not quite the same. So pull out the bolt carrier, and we'll go ahead and go over that. Again, very, very AK-esque. But there are a couple of notable differences. One of them is that on the piston you have these three little lugs here, which are describing their function is a little bit difficult because they actually do multiple things. One thing that they do is they kind of help orient the piston in the piston tube and the gas, what we usually call the gas tube on AKs. Technically, it's not a gas tube; it's a piston tube, or piston guide tube, but we all call it a gas tube. So part of it is just helping orient the piston in there, but also these lugs do make a little bit of contact with the sides of the gas tube and therefore act as scraper lugs as well, and just kind of helps clear out some of the gunk as it builds up and keeps that area relatively free. Now, one thing that you will notice is that there's actually a little bit of play. Don't know if you can hear that. Yeah, there's actually a little bit of play in the piston itself, and that's actually normal for AK-type designs. That play is there so that if the gun, in the course of firing it, and this would usually be a full auto type event, but if in the course of firing it, the gun heats up significantly, AK-type guns tend to droop a little bit, so the front end actually starts to go down a little bit, and you need a little bit of play in the piston so that it can actually go through that transition, so that it can go through that droop without malfunctioning. This is one of the things that allows AKs to run in full auto much longer than, say, their AR-15 type counterparts. AR-15s are basically designed so that after a certain number of rounds, after it gets heated up to a certain point, it's gas tube, and they have a very small little gas tube on them, at least on a standard AR design. The internal piston system, often called a direct impingement system, that system is designed with a very small gas tube, very small diameter, and if it heats up enough, it fails. And that prevents the rest of the gun from being significantly damaged. AK-type designs were not designed with that failsafe in mind. They are designed to keep running basically as long as you need them to run. Instead of saving equipment, the idea was to save the soldier. And so they keep running, usually well past when they should, to make sure that the soldier has something that's operable. And so that's why they have kind of a loose piston on a lot of them. They're at least supposed to have a loose piston on them. Some American manufacturers, namely PSA, their pistons aren't usually loose, and that's actually a detriment to their design. It's not true to what AKs were designed to be, but that's a topic for another time, I suppose. And then the bolts and the bolt carrier, this part is very, very, very similar to the AK, except of course the charging handle is on the opposite side and moved back a little bit because this is a gun that's basically been redesigned for right-handers, and so the charging handle got moved to the left side, which is typical for right-handers. But other than that, it is very, very AK in design. The channel is basically the same. This is made, of course, for a 7.62x51 gun, so it's bigger than on a standard AK, but all the basic components are there. As to the bolt itself, it's actually a more modern bolt design because the extractor is an external extractor. You can see the extractor from the outside even if you're not looking at the face of the bolt. That's called an external extractor, and that is a more modern extractor design for AKs. Excuse me. You see that on like the 74s and the 100 series guns. It's basically just a simplification. It allows for a little bit easier manufacture of the bolt itself, and also it allows debris to move out a little bit more freely. In the original design, there would actually be a part of the bolt that would actually cover up the outside of the extractor, and debris could get stuck in there. And so making the extractor external makes it easier for debris to get out. So that is a good thing. And then also, as I mentioned in a previous video, this firing pin is actually spring-loaded, so you got to really push on it in order to get it to come out. You can just barely see it poking out there. But yeah, it is a spring-loaded firing pin, which is kind of an interesting thing for rifles in general. And as I mentioned in the last video, that was done to help it be compatible with 308 Winchester. There's a few differences between 7.62x51 and 308 Winchester. One is that 7.62x51 will sometimes have a deeper throat because it's a military round, and military rounds will often include tracers. And in order to accept a tracer, you usually have to have a little bit deeper throat because tracer rounds are kind of long on the front end. So 7.62x51 has a little bit deeper throat. And then in terms of pressure, 7.62x51 is actually loaded to less pressure than 308 Winchester, at least as per, SAMI spec. That'll vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, but technically speaking, 308 Winchester is considered a higher pressure round. Now, with something that is as overbuilt as this, because this is considerably larger than a standard AK bolt, that difference in pressure is going to be a moot point, and most foreign manufacturers will build to the 308 spec in terms of pressure. It's usually only guns that are made here in the US according to basically US designs, US manufacture, US-based manufacturers, I should say. That the differences in pressure can be a big thing, but most of the time, especially when you're dealing with a foreign-made gun, they will build it to the higher pressure spec. And so this Galil accepts the higher pressure, and it will have a little bit deeper throat on it because it's 7.62x51, and so it'll be able to accept, actual military rounds, which would have to be designed to accept some of the tracers. And then the other major difference between 7.62x51 and 308 Winchester is, of course, the primer issue that I mentioned in the last video. 308 primers are sometimes much lighter than 7.62x51 primers, just because 308 is often considered to be a commercial load, whereas 7.62x51 is not. And so 7.62x51 and NATO, being a NATO cartridge, usually gets military primers that are usually quite a bit harder. And that helps prevent slam fires and things like that, but 308 Winchester rounds, they don't always get that. So to make sure that it can run both types of ammunition with both kinds of primers well, they spring-loaded the firing pin so that you wouldn't have the problem of slam fires with the 308 Winchester stuff. Alright, we're almost completely field stripped. There's one more component, and that is the gas tube. On a normal AK, there's usually a little lever on the side, and you flip the lever and then the whole gas tube comes up from the top. Well, you kind of have to tilt it forward. But on Galil's, there is no rear sight block. Instead, it's basically a smooth transition from the front of the gun to the end of the gun. There is no block juncture anymore. And so the gas tube on especially the Gen 2 versions, actually fits inside the handguard, and it is just this little thing right here. Not too much of anything, really. And it really is pretty much nothing more than a tube. You'll see it has some vent holes at the front end. This is for the gases that operate the gun. Once they've driven the piston back a bit, you'll get to the holes, and then it will start venting out of the sides and not put extra pressure on the whole system. Basically just enough to get the piston going, and then it starts venting. And this design, where you actually have the holes on the tube itself, is actually a lot closer to the original AKs. Basically the Type 1 through the Type 3 AKs, when you still kind of had that semi-milled thing going on. Well, the Type 2 and Type 3 were both milled guns, if I remember right. But they had their vents in the gas tube. Modern AKMs, what we usually think of as an AK today, they have their vent holes on the gas block. And that was, part of it was just simple design choices, not necessarily essential in any way, but you can see the kind of the genesis of the Galil, and that the Galils branched off from the normal AK line before the vent holes got moved to the the gas block, they are still in the gas tube. So this represents an early stage in AK development. So you still have that. You'll also notice that this is basically a perfectly smooth tube. On standard AKs, they went with a fluted tube. And that fluted tube was basically there to kind of help move debris out of the way. It gave you channels for the debris to fall into so that it wouldn't be in the way of the piston. Galils, you can encounter the same problem with it. And of course, in a smooth tube, you don't have anywhere for debris to go. You don't have those fluted channels that regular AKs have. And that is why you have the scraper lugs on the piston of a Galil, whereas you do not usually have these scraper lugs on normal AKs. It's because of the shape of the tube. The shape of the tube is perfectly smooth, and so to keep debris moving and not piling up, you have the scraper lugs to help clean it out. Normal AKs don't need that because normal AKs have fluted gas tubes. But this design is much smaller in profile, which helps it fit into the gun a little bit easier. So there are pros and cons. And then the back end of the gas tube, you will see, has a cutout in the bottom, and that is mostly just for fitment type issues. And then has a couple of very, very, very small wings on the side, and those fit into grooves that are in the front trunnion, basically. Well, it's actually right above the front trunnion, but the forward part of the receiver, it fits into little grooves there, and has a couple of flanges up top to kind of help guide the piston in as you're assembling it and all that kind of stuff. And then at the very top, you have a little ledge that the dust cover actually fits into, kind of a tongue and groove kind of thing. So just kind of show you guys how that matches up. Yeah, just like that. And in my experience, all the difficulty in reassembling this gun comes from not getting these parts aligned right here, the gas tube and the dust cover. If you misalign those in any way, then you're going to have trouble getting it back together. But if you can get that right, I find that the reassembly is usually relatively decent. Like I said, I'll show you guys and you guys can make your own decision, but that is the gas tube. Right, and then inside of that, you have the normal locking lugs that you would expect to see on an AK design. This is a milled receiver, so you don't have some of the cross bracing that you see in the stamped receiver AKs. And that is both a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing is that it is, since it's a milled receiver, it tends to be very strong, very precise, wonderfully smooth action and all that. But the downside of not having those little cross pieces in there is that you have to be really careful, and with regular AKs you should be really careful of this as well, but you need to be really careful of dropping that hammer. On a normal AK, there's a little strut in front of the hammer that if you let the AK hammer drop, it'll hit that strut, and that's not good for the AK because it'll bend that strut and it'll actually cause the stamped receiver to kind of close in a little bit, but it keeps it from going all the way around. On this one, there's nothing that keeps the hammer from going all the way around. So when the gun is disassembled, generally it's not a good idea to drop the hammer just because of the risk of it going all the way around, and then trying to get it back up is a major pain. So if you are going to go ahead and drop the hammer, be aware of what can happen, and basically you're going to have to expect to hold it in place, because once it gets around to the other side, it's going to be really hard to move it back. So you're going to have to manually hold it in place, and you should do that with AKs anyway. But on normal AKs, you can hold it in place and then slowly drop it to that cross piece. And then that's fine because it's not hitting the cross piece at full force, and then you can do whatever you need to do behind the hammer, you know, clean in, that kind of stuff. But on this one, it doesn't have any piece that's nice to drop it on, so you're going to have to hold it in place for as long as you need that hammer to be up. So just be aware of that and be cautious about that. So you get the hammer and all that, and the normal trigger mech, and then you get the safety, and then behind the safety you got another little device that extends to the external safety that's on the opposite side that most AKs don't have, but this one does. So there's the normal trigger mech with its safety system, and then there's basically a little transport bar system that connects to the external safety. Alright, so that is the gun disassembled. Now let's go ahead and reassemble it. We will basically just do the reverse order. We'll start with the gas tube. And like I said, the gas tube and the rear dust cover are the things that really need to be very carefully aligned. So you want to make sure that those little flared portions go into the grooves that are there for it. And then the front end of it will also need to be pretty carefully aligned. And that is oftentimes easier said than done. There we go. Okay, so have that all pushed forward, and I'm going to start tilting the gun down so that this doesn't have a tendency to come back up. So still have that tilted down. Then we'll go ahead and take the bolts carrier and the bolts and reassemble them. I basically just drop the bolts in, keep twisting it until you basically can't twist it anymore. Push it forward while rotating it, and it should look like that. And you'll want that bolt to remain forward as you put it in, so it's going to be tilted downwards. The gun itself is going to be tilted downwards. And remember, the tolerances on Galils are a little bit tighter, so you need to be pretty flat to the receiver. On normal AKs, you can start pretty high and go in, be just fine. But this one, you're going to want to start a lot lower. So start it lower, get it over the rear, push it down over the hammer. It should slide into place relatively easily. That's usually not too bad. Then after that comes the recoil spring. And like I said, this tab gets in the way for normal reassembly that you do on most AKs. Most of the time you just put it in place, smack the dust cover on it, and on most AKs that tab at the end is short enough that smacking the dust cover over it pushes it in enough to get it all to work. But these are extra long on Galils, and the original reason for that actually goes back to the use of rifle grenades. They found that normal AKs, that when you used rifle grenades with them, that the dust covers had the habit of popping off. So in the Galil design, they extended that tab so that wouldn't happen. Now, most modern Galils are never ever going to be used with rifle grenades. You know, Israel, you know, the people that make the Galil, they've gone to underbarrel grenade launchers very similar to what we use on the US guns like the M4 and whatnot. And so conventional old school rifle grenades are not really a thing anymore, but the tab design is left over from that, and we still have to contend with it. So what we're going to do, instead of putting it into place properly, like I said, I'm staying relatively horizontal to the receiver here. Instead of locking it in its locking recesses, I'm actually going to push it in under the end of the receiver there. So it's not quite in its slot, it's just under its slot basically. And then after that, I'm going to make sure that my my gas tube is all the way forward, because otherwise the next step becomes rather difficult. And then I'm going to take the dust cover and slide it into that little groove that I showed you earlier. And then hinge it down. And there we go. Now it's basically in place, but you can see that the tab is not poking through yet. So I'm going to hold it down while running the action, and that should pop the charging handle out. And sorry, not the charging handle, but it should pop the little locking tab out, and that is exactly what has happened. Now, I have seen some people in reassembling the dust cover do things like taking a mallet and smacking it on. That does technically work, but it really isn't necessary as long as you have the gas tube properly aligned and you have the dust cover properly aligned to the gas tube. If you do that, just simple forward pressure and downward pressure is enough to get it in the right groove, and then, you know, it's pretty easy from there. So is this the easiest takedown and reassemble that there is out there? No, there are other guns that are definitely easier. And like I said, I do prefer to use some kind of a tool to push the tab in to start with, because otherwise trying to push in that tab while yanking the dust cover off can result in problems. Like I said, the first couple of times that I did it, I managed to smack myself in the face pretty good, and that was unpleasant, and so I use the tool now. You know, and like I said, there are people who will ding that against the gun. You shouldn't have to use any tools to disassemble, and technically you don't, but it's a lot easier with, I'm just saying. And there are people that are, you know, absolutely adamant that you really have to beat the dust cover on, and I personally have not found that to be the case. Like I said, as long as the gas tube is properly aligned and the dust cover is properly aligned with the gas tube, I haven't found it to be a big issue. It does take a little bit of pressure, but, you know, thumb pressure is basically all that's required, and it works just fine. Is that too hard? Is that too easy? Well, that's going to be up to you guys. You know, if you're looking at buying one of these things and you want something that's super, super easy, it's not super easy. But I wouldn't say that it's super hard either. You know, take it for what it is. And there are obviously a lot of components of this gun that are very, very, very AK-esque. That's very clearly where it comes from. It's definitely an AK-derived design, but there are a few differences from modern AKMs. There's a lot of similarity, but also a few differences here and there. And hopefully you guys found that useful and interesting. All right, for those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you will come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.